Hi, this is Subratha and welcome to UPLR's Staffroom, where we discuss good practice and bring up questions for debate. And today we'll be looking at the importance of fluidity in planning and grouping. So have your cup of tea ready, relax, and let's get started. I've been in education been teaching 8 years, and I was a class-based teacher, and in that time I got to witness so many different people teaching because I was also a PPA teacher. Now, what that means is I would go, for those of you who are international, PPA stands for Planning, Preparation and Assessment Time. So another teacher would come in and relieve the teacher to do their paperwork and planning and assessment and all these sorts of things. And so I will get to teach their class for a day. And that meant that I got to see lots of different styles of teaching, because usually the teachers would want me to be consistent with how they taught their lessons. And that meant I had to really adapt myself so that I was ensuring consistency in that classroom. And I would have to adopt certain approaches that were already set up that really didn't belong to me. And one of them was fluidity in planning and grouping. Now, I worked with a Year 6 teacher. It was a previous colleague of mine, and she was just amazing. She was this wonderful woman. Everything she did was just effortless, or it appeared that way. And, I had a lot of admiration for her. And I would go into her class to cover her lessons for her PPA, and the woman wouldn't have any table groups. So I would go in there, and at first it was a lot to wrap my head around. I mean, good table grouping is one of the backbones of any classroom, and she just wouldn't have it. But it worked. Her style worked. And I feel very privileged that I actually got a chance to work with her, because when I adopted this approach, I really did see a massive improvement in the way my children learned and their progress, of course, and the way that it promoted their independence in the classroom was just great. So I thought I would share this technique with you in this video today. So in an ideal world, you will have a class which looks something like this. You'd have a certain number of high ability children, your middle ability children, and you would have your lower ability children, and you would group them into something that looks a bit like this. So you'd have about 6 children on each table, and for your lower ability kids, you'd either work with them yourself, or if you are lucky enough to have a teaching assistant, and I know not all schools have them, you would have your teaching assistant or yourself working with any one of these groups here. And ideally, during the course of the week, you would get round to all of these groups by the time you get to Friday. So you would have rotated around them all. Now, in an ideal world, if your class demographic is a bit like this, then it would be quite easy just to do 3 differentiated tasks for any particular lesson. So one for your higher, one for your middle, and one for your lower ability children. And for the lower ability, you would make the worksheet or any activity that they do scaffolded a lot more. And with the higher ability children, you would have a lot more opportunities for challenge and extension. More about differentiation and things like that later, but for now we're just going to have a look at how our planning and our grouping of children and the layout of our classroom actually affects the way that the children learn and the outcomes that then, that comes from that. So this is the ideal, but in real life we don't always have children that come into neatly packaged higher, middle or lower ability. Sometimes it can be a bit like this. So here in this classroom you have a lot more lower ability children, and it would be easy to then say, okay, we can divide them up like this. So now you'd have the class teacher and the teaching assistant probably working quite heavily with these bottom two groups here, and during the lesson they will obviously circulate. The class teacher would probably circulate in this instance and make sure that everybody is staying on track and that they understand what they're doing. But even this is still a little bit too neatly packaged. So when you have something that looks like this, now I had a class that looked like this once, and it was incredibly hard work. And this is a lot more reflective of what real life is like. So you're going to have your tops, you're going to have your middles, and here you're going to have your lower ability children. And I've highlighted the orange ones, out of which who can work quite independently, and they're a little bit on the higher end, but they're not quite good enough to go to this middle section here. Here you have your very SEN children. Now these children might come with their own PSAs, or due to lack of funding they may not. But these children would require quite extensive and heavy support, and these two may be your very tops. So they're your incredibly bright, incredibly independent. Usually they are quite mature for their age, and sometimes they can get bored very quickly, so this lot could tend to misbehave as well. So you've got both ends of the spectrum there. They could either be really sensible and you can just rely on them to do what they need to do, or they could actually go the other way, which is they might want your attention and misbehave because they might feel that they're not being challenged enough. So you've got a range, and more often than not, your classroom is going to look something like this. So one of the ways that you could divide up your children into groups is something like this. So here you have your two tables, who would be your lower ability children, and again your teaching assistant and yourself might alternate between these tables here, and you would have enough challenge and extension for these kids. You might split up the two bright sparks up here, and then you've kind of mix them up a little bit so that, you know, when they're stuck for help, for example, they've got each other to turn to. And that's the great thing about having table groups, is that it allows for collaboration between the children, and I think that's fantastic. But there is another way. There is another way. If this grouping is set in stone, then what happens is that the children have to come to you each time they finish something before they can go on to the next activity. Even if you give them the flexibility of saying, okay, if you finish that, you can go on to this next sheet, for example, there is another way of doing it. So I like to do this. I would get my two support tables into horseshoes so that I can sit myself in the middle there, and so can my TA, and we might alternate between the two. And I would have a resource table where all of the worksheets or the extensions for the activities that I'm doing would be laid out in this section here, so that if anybody has finished, they have the choice and the freedom to come up and get the next sheet. If they wanted to, they can come and see me and show me first if they're not sure. And usually once I've given them the go ahead, then they go to the resource table and get the next sheet, and off they go. So I find that this is a really good way of grouping the children, and when you're planning, make sure that you have enough of the extensions and all of the resources available for each lesson. It is a little bit more time and resource heavy, but in the lesson it really does pay off in the long run. So usually what happens is when you start your English lesson, for example, or your maths lesson, you might say, get into your English groups or your maths groups, and the children will automatically know which tables they need to go to for which group. It's just setting on a smaller scale. And once they do this, then within those groups, they won't really move for the duration of the lesson. But the way I like to do things, and the way that and this is the technique I learnt from my colleague, is that at the start of the lesson, you have them sit wherever they want, okay? And have their whiteboards out, and you start by asking them some really simple AFL questions related to the topic that you're about to do. And AFL stands for Assessment for Learning. More videos on that later. So you would ask them their questions. They would write the answer onto their whiteboard, hold it up for you to see, and this process might take a maximum of 5 minutes, no longer than 5 minutes. And then you would say, okay, so now I roughly know where everyone is. Then you would teach the main part of the lesson, and then you leave it to the children. And you would say, okay, if you feel that you need more support, come and sit on these 2 tables here. If you feel that you're okay, but you might need a little bit of supervision when I kind of dip in, then come and sit on this table here. And if you feel like you completely understand what you're going to do, then I would like you to sit on these 2 tables here. What you're enabling the children to do is you are enabling them to self-evaluate right at the very start of the lesson. And if they also have a list of success criteria right at the very beginning, that will be able to aid them in their self-evaluation as well. So what happens now is you are allowing the children to take responsibility for their learning. If they need help from you or the teaching assistant, then they will come and sit here. If they feel like they're okay, then they will sit here. And if they feel like they're really okay and they really don't need you, then they will go and sit on these 2 tables here. And then if you've already set it up so that all the extra extensions and challenges are all on the resource table, then what the children do is they move about the classroom, but in a way that will aid their learning a lot better. Now, for this to work properly, then your behavior management really do have to be on point. And once you've got that down and you can trust the children to move about in a sensible and appropriate way, then what happens is you'll find that you're constantly assessing where the children are throughout the lesson. So doing it this way enables you to know where all of the children are. If they have any concerns, if the children know that they need you, it's an opportunity for them to raise their concerns with you. So let's say 10 minutes into the lesson, you've supported this group so that they're aware of what it is that they need to do. And now you're free to give them a mini independent activity that scaffolds them to the next step. And then you can kind of dip into these tables here and make sure that anyone who has misconceptions, you address those misconceptions straight away. And then if it is that, say, this child's finished, so these 2 are quite fast, then you introduce the extension to them and you let them get on with it. You introduce it to the whole table. So now they're going to be independent right until to the very end. So once you've done that, then you come back, you might, dip into this table too, and then you come here and you check on to make sure how these guys are doing. And you just literally circulate your time between the 2 groups up until the very end. And if anybody has a question, then of course they can raise their hand and ask you as well. So what happens with fixed table grouping is that the children are labelled as higher ability, middle ability and lower ability. And that usually isn't looked at until the end of the half term or end of term. And with fluid grouping, then you're actually assessing where the children are during the lesson and at the end of every lesson, which is what you should be doing anyway. But this kind of reflects in the lesson because the children are moving according to where they think they are and according to where you think they are as well. It is a bit of a collaboration now. So because they have their success criteria, they know exactly what their next steps are and they can make an informed choice about where to sit. And at the same time, you can also guide them in that process as well. So the dynamics of the classroom, plus having the success criteria there, it just reinforces where they are in their learning. Not only does it reinforce where they are in their learning, but it also allows you to group them a lot more efficiently, a lot more dynamically, and target exactly what those children need, simply because you're looking at their grouping so often. But it's also manageable because you're taking the children's thoughts and their feedback into account. So what would usually happen in the lesson is when you are planning, you will plan lots of AFL questions into your lesson. So you would start off by giving them the AFL question first. The children then answer that AFL question, and depending on the type of answers that they give, you can take stock of how much they understand what you've taught them and whether they have any misconceptions. You can then group accordingly. So those children who have the most misconceptions you can keep with you, whilst those children who you can see really do understand and can get onto the independent activity, you're not having them sit there wasting their time while you're explaining things again to the children who don't understand, and you're relieving them and you're saying, okay, you can go to the table over there and you can get on, and I'm just going to work with this group. So now you've got the groups happening. So once the children are working in those groups for a while, they will then get to practice what you've taught them. And once they've practiced it, you've given them, say, 5 to 10 minutes to get on with the activity. You've explained things to the group that you're working with. And now you can start doing some AFL questions with that particular group. And the cycle starts again. So those children in that group who's got it. So let's say you have 6 children in your group and 2 of them have got it. So you say, okay, so now you can go on to the independent activity, go and find yourselves a seat. So then you ask the question to the rest of the class and you say, okay, those of you who are working independently, is there anyone who on second thought needs a little bit more help now? How is it going? And you might then actually go around and visit all of those other tables to make sure that there aren't any children who are not sure what to do and are a bit too shy to tell you about it. So if there are children like that, you can insist that they move to the horseshoe table where you're working with your children that might need a little bit more support. And in this way, you are constantly assessing where the children are, what their needs are, and at the same time, the children also can assess where they are and request help if they need. And so by having the table groupings so flexible and having that fluidity in the classroom, then you can address the needs of each child more appropriately. So in my lessons that I will be sharing with you on this channel, especially the 1 hour long grammar lessons, my planning will reflect this process. And I think it's really important that I share with you the way that I organize my classroom, because the planning that I write reflects these procedures that I had in place. Now, some people might feel that due to perhaps behaviour things that go on in the classroom, that they're just not that comfortable letting their children walk around in the classroom. But there are ways. To get around this, you give them a time period in which they can move. So you say, okay, now is the time for you to move. Once you've moved, that's it. You're going to stay there for the next 10 minutes until I give you time again to reflect on where you're at. Do you need more support, or would you like to carry on? And that will be the next time that you can move tables or seats. So that's a way of getting around the fact that sometimes children might take advantage of the fact that they've got a little bit more freedom to move around and might be tempted to mess about. I hope this video has been useful, guys. I will be referring teachers back to this video anytime I do full 1 hour long grammar lessons, etc. Because a lot of the time when I do plan, so that I've planned it so that the children can be fluid in their lessons, then this is one of the videos I will refer to at the end and say make sure you watch this video so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Do drop me a comment, guys. Let me know how you find this technique. If you've trialed it in your classrooms, then I'd love to know how you found the experience and how your class responded to this technique as well. Now, with any technique that you introduce in the class, the first time will always be novel to the children, and it will take some time for them to get used to it and for that to become normal practice. So I do urge you that if you are going to use this fluidity of grouping technique, then that you stick with it for at least a half term and see how, once the children have settled into the new practice, how that affects the children's progress then. Take care, guys, and stay tuned for more tips and practices for increasing progress in your classroom. And if you have any ideas, then I'd love to hear from you. Do drop me a comment to let me know if you have a particular way of grouping your kids. I'd love to hear it. Write it in the comment section below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. There will be lots of tips and tricks to come to improve your teaching practice in the classroom, as well as give you tips to save you time and energy. Check out my website, guys, for more planning and resources to help supplement your lessons in the classroom. The Staffroom series is designed to be videos that are a lot more relaxed and isn't really designed to be shown to the kids. And the other videos like Word of the Day series, the spelling tests and the 1 hour grammar lessons, these are designed for you to be able to use these with your children directly in the classroom, and the planning and resources for those lessons can be downloaded on my website. Check out the description box below. So hit that subscribe button. Lots of content to come that will make your life a lot easier. So take care, have a great day, and until then, bye for now. There's my cup. It actually doesn't have any tea in it, but there you go.